Welcome to The Forest Garden, a podcast for gardeners who want to upgrade their landscapes into biodiverse food forest systems. On today's episode of The Forest Garden, we will be covering the ethics of permaculture as outlined by Bill Mollison in his book, Introduction to Permaculture. Just a few days ago, I was lucky enough to find a hard copy of this book on a free table at a local farmer's market, which inspired me to record the episode. We'll also be discussing some of the shortfallings of permaculture, ethical questions, problems, and solutions. Stick with us. Hey there, everyone. Here we are again with another podcast from the field. I'm sitting in yet another bamboo forest area, but this time on my sister's property in Papaaloa, Hawaii, which is on the Hamakua coast of the Big Island of Hawaii. Today's episode is going to be a lot more commentary than anything else, quite a bit of opinion, honestly, and we're going to talk about something that has been on my mind for a little while now, which concerns the ethics around permaculture and some of the challenges or problems and potentials of permaculture, things that have been criticized quite a bit by outsiders and people within the permaculture community. There's been a few other podcasts I've listened to in the past year that have had some really hard takes on permaculture as a concept, and a lot of what they're criticizing is pretty valid, to be honest. Some of the things that are talked about are just the general lack of science to back up a lot of the things that are done by permaculture practitioners. Things like that we talked about in our very first episode, like dynamic accumulators, don't have a lot of science backing up what they're supposedly do, basically. The idea that they rapidly accumulate lots of minerals from deep in the soil and then cycle it back into the soil at the topmost layers where it can be accessed by the other plants that you plant around the dynamic accumulators. It's an awesome idea, and it probably, it's probably happening, it's probably true, but there just hasn't been a lot of science to sort of back it up. And that's the case for a lot of the things that are talked about in the permaculture sphere. So that's one criticism that I hear quite a bit, and I mean, I don't have a big defense for it, honestly. I mean, a lot of what permaculture has been is people's personal experiences and saying this works on my property or this works in my eco-village, and maybe it'll work for you too if you're in a similar climate. And there's nothing wrong with that, in my opinion. A lot of the time, amateur naturalists have made discoveries that have completely changed the world. So why not share your experiences with others, especially the most successful experiences that you've had? It just seems like I don't really have a big problem with that. One thing that we will also talk about today is sort of the monetization side of things, which I do have more of an issue with. I understand that everybody's got to eat, and a lot of the times, even on this podcast, I mean, we haven't monetized it. This podcast was meant to be informative, accessible to everyone, and monetizing it would sort of just take it down a road that I'm not sure that we need to go. It's not necessary. But that isn't really the way that everybody approaches this sort of type of information. Even though permaculture was meant to be something that everyone could access and be shared, it was also set up in a way that there was the PDC method is a little odd, because pretty much anyone can teach a PDC so long as they've taken a PDC, which is a permaculture design course. So there's been a lot of criticism around that as well, in terms of some people who just really maybe they only took one PDC and they kind of didn't really pay attention, but then they immediately go home to a completely different climate, completely different place, and decide that they're going to host, they're going to start up their own PDC classes, and they lead a bunch of people astray with just bad suggestions. That definitely can happen, and that's certainly a fault in the system of the permaculture design course method. Is that it was designed so that everyone could have access to it, but that obviously has some sort of drawbacks. But I'm getting way ahead of myself here, kind of just rambling, which I guess this episode is going to be a very long-form ramble, perhaps. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to read a little excerpt from Introduction to Permaculture by Bill Mollison with Rennie Mia Slay. I picked this up at a free table at a local farmer's market, the Hamakua Harvest Farmers Market on the Hamakua coast. It was an awesome day where they had their yearly festival just the other day, and I was totally stoked to find this book just sitting there with a free sign above it, because I've always wanted to nab a copy. I've read it before as a PDF, but having the physical thing is really cool. So this section on permaculture ethics, Bill Mollison sort of lined out 12 ethics that we can implement in our own lives that he defined as earth care. So here they are. I'm just going to read them to you one at a time. Ways that we can implement the earth care ethics in our own lives are as follows. Think about the long-term consequences of your actions. Plan for sustainability. Where possible, use species native to the area or those naturalized species known to be beneficial. The thoughtless introduction of potentially invasive species may upset natural balances in your home area. Cultivate the smallest possible land area. Plan for small-scale, energy-efficient, intensive systems rather than large-scale, energy-consuming, extensive systems. Be diverse, polycultural as opposed to monocultural. This provides stability and helps us be ready for change, whether environmental or social. Increase the sum of yields. Look at the total yield of the system provided by annuals, perennials, crops, trees, and animals. Also regard energy saved as a yield. Use low-energy environmental, solar, wind, and water, and biological, plant-animal systems to conserve and generate energy. Bring food growing back into the cities and towns where it has been always traditionally been in sustainable societies. Assist people to become self-reliant and promote community responsibility. Reforest the earth and restore fertility to the soil. Use everything at its optimum level and recycle all wastes. See solutions, not problems. Work where it counts. Plant a tree where it will survive. Assist people who want to learn. So those are some pretty awesome ethics to sort of shape a movement around. One of the things that really stands out to me is when he talks about bringing food back into the cities, because in my own practice as a landscape architect, that's something that I'm really excited to do in the future. I'm not a landscape architect yet. I'm in school for it. But that's an aside. Just thinking about these ethics as a whole, they're pretty wholesome, and unfortunately, the ethics that are outlined here don't totally encompass what permaculture had become only shortly after this book was published. One thing that it doesn't say here is do all these things and then monetize that model and sell it to other people. It says work where it counts, assist people who want to learn. So theoretically, this, permaculture should be something that is given freely and shared with everyone in a perfect world where we don't need to rely on an outside market, or we don't need to exist within a greater sphere of capitalism. And that's one thing that isn't really talked about maybe enough when permaculture and sort of sustainable communities are advocating these sort of ideas, is that almost always there is a greater reliance on the market and on capitalism as a whole. If you're a sustainable community or an eco-village that needs to function, you need to pay taxes, unfortunately, because of the way that land works in most countries, or all countries, is, you have to pay taxes on the land that you're on, which is not, that's a whole different discussion about whether or not that should be the case. But so in order to pay taxes, you need to have some sort of income, and often that income comes in the form of a good or a service. It could be that you sell soy. There's communities in Virginia that make hammocks and sell soy, and they're very reliant on the soy market, to keep things going. If the price of soy goes down, that's not good for the community. And my dad actually used to make hammocks at one of those places down in Virginia back in the 70s. Anyways, if you have any sort of permaculture property, they often include something similar to the idea of a market garden. The idea being that you're going to produce fresh vegetables with the best, most healthiest soils. You're going to regenerate the land that you're on while making a product is often the case. And Bill Mollison even mentions this early on in the first page of this book. Let's see exactly what he says. As I saw permaculture in the 1970s, it was a beneficial assembly of plants and animals in relation to human settlements, mostly aimed towards household and community self-reliance, and perhaps as a quote-unquote commercial endeavor, only arising from a surplus from that system. Now that that last sentence there it comes when you look at it through the lens of what permaculture kind of has become over time. It's kind of a loaded comment. As you know, let's just read that one more time. And perhaps as a quote-unquote commercial endeavor, only arising from a surplus from that system. So then the question becomes, is the purpose of your community to create a surplus? Because how is this community going to exist within a greater framework of capitalism without creating a surplus that can be marketable? Or is the idea that you're going to be completely self-reliant, entirely detached from the rest of society, and just not need to rely on making any sort of income or money to pay for the land that you're living on, or pay taxes or what have you? I mean, often most farms have at least one person working a full-time job so that they can pay the bills, because that's just the way that our capitalist world works these days, and it's not great. There's a lot of discussion that can be had as to why that shouldn't be the case, but unfortunately it just sort of is. And the way that, one of my biggest criticisms is sort of the selling DVDs side of permaculture that I feel like is sort of being phased out. I hope that less and less people are buying $100 DVDs to learn about how to be a permaculture practitioner or how to change, their personal slice of life, or how to change their world from the ground up with a permaculture mindset. Because that sort of idea of, I'm the permaculture guy and I'm going to teach you everything and you're going to just buy this product that everybody else has bought, and it's a carbon copy that I created, that you're going to watch it and then learn everything that I know is problematic, in my opinion. So if we just kind of go back to the original permaculture ethics and look at them sort of one by one, I feel like everybody can practice permaculture in their own way and introduce permaculture into their, whether it's farming or forest gardening or backyard forest garden, at any scale. These ethics, I feel like it's something that we, even somebody who's not intending to is probably doing already. So here's one: cultivating the smallest possible land area and planning for small-scale, energy-efficient, intensive systems rather than large-scale, energy-consuming, extensive systems. That's sort of a no-brainer, like if you're deciding that you're going to start up a farm or create a forest garden, most people are going to do it at a small practical scale on their small property, or in a section of their property if they have a large one, before they decide to go gangbusters. A lot of the ethics that are listed here are sort of like, duh, shouldn't we all be doing this? But it's a good reminder to sort of bring you back to what the intentions, or what your intentions should be as a practitioner. Another thing that Bill Mollison says, that we're just going to go back to here: assist people to become self-reliant and promote community responsibility. Frequently I find that permaculture is practiced by, unfortunately, a lot of white people. I'm a white guy, and a lot of landowners. And there isn't a lot of permaculture being practiced in community spaces, or being pushed to be implemented in community spaces. Often I feel like the vast majority are in private land. And that's something that everybody can just sort of take a note of, how can I change that? How can I take my community park and approach the town council and say, listen, I spent the past 6 years turning my backyard into a paradise. It's an ecological paradise, and I want to share that with the community. And so I can take divisions of my plants and I can bring them, and we can have a community work day, and we can create even a small garden on this open lawn and change things. And maybe other people will come and they'll notice that this community garden is really awesome and it's a public space that everyone can enjoy, that someone can show up and harvest raspberries on a given day, and it's free. And it's definitely, it's happening. There are organizations and groups of people out there who are doing it. Mount Joy Community Orchard in Portland, Maine is a fantastic example. I rolled up there a couple of years ago, and a poet laureate was picking raspberries, quote unquote, for his sweetie's birthday the next day, because he was going to make some sort of raspberry tart, and read a poem just off the top of his head. It was an incredible experience to have in a community garden / community orchard / permaculture orchard. And those sort of spaces, I feel like, just sort of facilitate that kind of experience, an experience that is just one of a kind, where you're going to bump into someone who has similar goals or mindsets, or you bump into someone who has similar ideals to you, basically, and someone who you might be able to create a friendship with. We need more community landscapes like this, where two people can encounter one another, hit it off, and then potentially work together to make change in the world, the change that they want to see. And it can start with simply just finding a hillside that is a grassy slope. We have way too many mowed lawns in public spaces and in private spaces that can be transformed, and it can be our job to do that. I imagine many of you have already started or done a lot more than I have. I haven't converted dozens of lawns to food forests, so I'd like to, and I'm working on it. That brings me back to the idea of private versus public. Even in the circumstance that permaculturalists or practitioners, or whatever you want to call them, forest gardeners, backyard food forests, designers, people who are taking private landscapes and turning them into food forests, or a racing lawn and turning them into meadow, or what have you, just creating diversity where there wasn't any, that is still huge. That is a amazing endeavor that Bill Mollison probably would be super stoked about. Even if it's not on a grand scale or a public scale, it could be 1/10 of an acre, it could be 1/4 of an acre. There's just acres and acres, thousands of acres, millions of acres of lawn in the United States and elsewhere that is irrigated and mowed every single year. And it doesn't need to be that way. Our lawns are ecological deserts. Something as simple as just ripping out that lawn and replacing it with white clover, which is a ground cover that can provide forage for bees, is huge. If you go even farther and it becomes, maybe a wildflower meadow, or you plant fruit trees, even better. And that's what we're all about, Ecology should be at the forefront of our designs. And even if that ecology is happening at a small scale or on a private scale, at a private land, if everybody in the U.S. took their private land and transformed it in that way, we'd be in a much better place than we are now. Obviously, working towards creating community resilience and community landscapes is super important, and in my opinion, more important than private landscapes. But, we one step at a time. The more private landscapes that exist out there potentially will influence there being more public landscapes with the same sort of mentality behind it. Now, when Bill Mollison says, be diverse, polycultural, as opposed to monocultural, this provides stability and helps us to be ready for change, whether environmental or social. I think that's really, really important to sort of the crux of permaculture, or the crux of food forests design, because that idea of diversity in the landscape is so very, very important. One sort of critique that has been thrown out there is that the idea of stacking functions sometimes just doesn't work. And some things that you might find online especially will just advocate for some of the craziest guilds or stacking of functions in really tight spaces that you think, oh, that's amazing and that'll be awesome, but it just sometimes in practice it doesn't work, and that can be because of something very, very specific. And so often vines in guilds is a good example of this, where you'll see somebody using a hardy kiwi vine, for example, which is notorious for taking over, and they have it in a fields with a red maple, a tree that some people consider it to be a weed tree in the East Coast. And that's great. If it's not, imagine it's in an open field, it's not next to a wooded border, and it's not going to escape that It's not going to escape the lab potentially, or maybe it still will, but that tree is being used as a trellis, and it suddenly is just loaded with food, and that food will be for humans and animals and birds primarily, which is, a lot of people might say, don't do that, don't give the kiwis to the birds so that they can spread the seeds all over the forest and potentially make hardy kiwi an invasive plant. And that's a big topic of discussion of whether or not the invasive should be included at all, but topic for another day maybe. But that idea of, the hardy kiwi vine climbing up a tree, it's context. Context is what's important. So if you were to plant a hardy kiwi vine at the base of your peach tree, and your peach tree is a dwarf variety that only grows to be 8 feet tall, that hardy kiwi vine is just going to strangle your tree. And the idea of stacking functions there is totally, totally not working, because your tree is going to be just girdled and strangled to death, and probably the hardy kiwi vine is going to grow way faster than the peach tree does and completely take over the canopy of that peach tree, making it so that no light gets in below it, and the tree can't photosynthesize and can't produce fruit, etc. And ultimately, the tree dies because your hardy kiwi becomes this big, thick, monstrous vine that produces hardy kiwis. But, the original reason why you planted it there wasn't to do that. You could have planted it on a trellis that was metal, and, it could have just not killed your tree. And often when the idea of polyculture designs and polyculture guilds is first discovered, it's really exciting. At least it was for me. It's like, I can take this one thing and stack it on this other thing, and then I'll get all these different yields from it. And that's something that Bill Mollison talks about, is try to get the most yields out of your system. But you have to be really careful when you do that, and you have to understand how each and every plant functions and how it might absolutely destroy your system if you let it get out of hand. What sort of management practices are you going to utilize to keep that plant in check? And maybe, the management practices that you utilize won't keep it in check, and it just shouldn't be planted there in the first place. Going on the same idea, the sort of 7 layers of the food forest, if we look at that same model of a peach tree with some sort of vining species wrapped around it, maybe it's a vining species that dies back every year. It's an herbaceous vine, in which case it's not really going to ever get, if in a cold climate, it's not ever going to really get so established that it's going to completely take over and damage your tree. The question is that vine going to, even if it's herbaceous, going to grow so fast and so vigorously that it completely shades out the understory and then doesn't allow any room for any of your understory plantings to do anything. So often you'll see guilds drawn up that have all these different layers under one fruit tree, and the question is there enough light getting through the canopy of that tree to do anything on ground? So you could have strawberries at the ground layer, and daikon radishes, and wine cap mushrooms, and above that some sort of shrub like a blueberry, and it's just probably isn't going to work unless you specifically know what you're doing. So a blueberry needs a lot of sun to produce fruit. It's not a good choice to put directly next to your fruit tree, especially if your fruit tree isn't pruned. If you have a fruit tree that's pruned, it's going to especially if it's like espaliate or it's pruned really, really hard, then that's going to be a different story. But for the context of this, let's assume that it's a semi-dwarf or dwarf tree that casts a fair amount of shade. Putting a blueberry right next to it, you're not going to ever harvest any blueberries. So you can look for a different variety or a different species entirely that is more shade tolerant. One good example of this is black currant or gooseberries. Gooseberries actually do better with a partial shade, not full shade, to produce a crop, because they can't handle direct humid summers with just direct sun beating down on them. They don't like that. So there are species out there that can handle some shade, and you really have to understand which species that will fit into that sort of niche in your polyculture design for it to work. Most of the time it doesn't work. It's pretty unique. You have to really, I imagine you could go through 100 iterations before you find exactly how closely planted the shrub that you choose is, so that it's a dwarf tree that could get affected by having a shrub planted so close to it. You could go through 100 iterations of how exactly these different parts work together. The idea of having strawberries on the ground, how are they going to fruit if you just have a dense canopy where no light can get to the ground layer? The answer there is that you need to have a wild variety of strawberry that is used to fruiting in areas that the sunlight is not as full and as strong, and the fruits don't grow to be that big in the first place. So there's some alpine strawberries out there and some white fruited varieties that I think would work well in this sort of situation, where they just don't need as much inputs of sunlight compared to the strawberries that you see in the store. Basically, you're not going to get a strawberry that this fits in your palm, or is the size of like just one of those massive strawberries that you see on store shelves. But you don't want one of those anyway, because they don't taste that good. You want an alpine variety or a small wild variety of strawberry that actually can handle some of the more shady conditions and still produce fruit. And even in that case, it might not produce fruit. It might, you might need to spend 10 years perfecting that guild before it actually produces for you in the way that you want, which is something that is not talked about often enough, is that a lot of the times that these things just don't work. Or you think that they work, and they work 1 year, and you tell your friend, oh, it worked great, and then he tries it and it doesn't work. And that just happens. It's a tricky system when you're taking 6 different things, putting them all together and just saying, oh, I'm maximizing the yields and I'm going to get a little bit of everything. And instead of a full crop harvest of peaches, I'm going to get some peaches, and I'm going to get some strawberries, I'm going to get some mushrooms, or a lot of mushrooms, because mushrooms really like shade. But point being here is that you really need to understand every species that you put into that system to get anything out of it, because it's really easy to put all the wrong things in the wrong place, and just things grow 6 feet or 7 feet tall as a shrub, and then your dwarf tree is shaded out by the shrub that you planted right next to it, and that just I guess I should have researched that cultivar a little bit better before I did that, and now I got to dig it up, and that's going to hurt the roots of the tree, and where do I go from here? It happens. These things happen, and it's not great. So that idea of increasing the sum of yields and looking at the total yields of a system provided by annuals, perennial crops, trees, and animals is a permaculture ethic that you really need to dive into and examine in your landscape, and come to an understanding of how that's going to work without overbalancing everything and messing everything up. A lot of these ethics are like that, where they're sort of double-sided. There's the in a perfect world, this would be awesome, and then there's the our world isn't perfect, and how is this going to work the way I want it to work in my landscape? Now, probably the biggest permaculture ethic that is repeated the most is see solutions, not problems. It's sort of a catchphrase of permaculture. It's like, take a problem and turn it into a solution. And some of these are pretty ingenious. Like, for example, if you have slugs on your property, you introduce ducks, and the ducks love slugs, and they will just eat every slug off of your citrus orchard and be totally happy about it, and then you don't have to feed the ducks, or you have to feed them less, and that's awesome. Or in the context of what I was just talking about with the fruit trees, maybe what you plant at the base is rhubarb because it leaves out way earlier than the tree does, and then it holds its form all summer long, and it stabilizes soil, and it's a part of the herbaceous layer that you can harvest at the end of the season. And that's a solution to a problem of there's too much shade being cast from this tree in my polyculture guild. And these sort of problems and solutions are prevalent throughout the everyday life of somebody who's cultivating dozens and dozens of different shrubs and trees and plants that are medicinal and edible in small spaces, or in rural spaces, or in urban spaces, or in big spaces, or whatever. Something that I deal with quite a bit on the East Coast is voles. All of the deep mulch systems that are advocated in permaculture create amazing vole habitat. And so how do you deal with, establishing hugel mounds that become vole apartment complexes? I'm not going to use poison because that defeats the whole purpose of everything that I'm doing. But what is the solution to, mousetraps? Okay, well, that requires me going out there every day and resetting up the mousetraps, and then also having to deal with dead voles everywhere that I have to get rid of. And then, okay, well, what if I get a cat? Well, cats are also terrible ecological disasters to most ecosystems, where they can really devastate bird habitats. So having an outdoor cat probably also isn't really the answer. And then you look to what native species can be in the area that already hunt voles, and for me the answer is raptors, which are large predatory birds, or snakes. So creating snake habitat would be to have rock walls and rock piles throughout the landscape, which I haven't had time to integrate yet. And I'm not sure where I would put large piles of rocks in a pretty small half an acre backyard forest garden in the first place. So then rock walls. Okay, well, that's really expensive. Where does the money come to build those rock walls so that this whole system works? And then we come back to the market and how money is an integral part of this whole thing. And it just becomes a big headache. But I did, instead of opting for the snakes, I ended up building owl boxes, which have yet to be filled by owls. In a wetland area, you can build an owl box from a PDF you can find online for free, which hopefully attracts an owl to come live in your landscape, and then the owls can hunt the rodents on your property and reduce vole pressure, is the idea. Unfortunately, I already have owls on my property, and they don't live in boxes. They take over, they're great horned owls, and they take over the nests of other things. So they'll just completely kick a bald eagle out of its nest, or which is crazy to think of, but probably more often a red-tailed hawk or some other sort of raptor species that created a beautiful nest at the top of the tree, and the great horned owl is the bigger bird, and it just comes in and says, "This is my nest now." So I can't decide where to put a nest close to where my forest garden is that it would be able to swoop down and eat the rodents on a regular basis. If I build a barn owl box, that might have been a little bit different, because I could have there is sort of a barn structure somewhat near the area that has the most vole pressure. But then the question becomes, it's in a somewhat suburban context, so are owls really supposed to be that close to the road? Probably not, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of questions and problems that can come up with every time that you introduce something new to the system. And you have to be very aware of what those problems could be before you make decisions about integrating new solutions to problems that could become problems of their own. This is true of the ducks too. I mean, if you introduce 100 ducks into a landscape where there weren't any ducks before, and there's only a small pond for them to inhabit, then their duck shit could turn that pond water into an ecological nightmare. And that is something that I've seen happen in a few different examples of people who red bill mollison, ducks, solution to slugs. You don't have a slug problem, you have a duck deficiency. Great, bring in a bunch of ducks, and then suddenly the ducks just completely overload the system. And that can happen again and again and again and again with all sorts of solutions that you bring in for your problems. So it really can be, sometimes it can be a nightmare. And in terms of how things work, I think what it comes down to is really light touches. Maybe you only get 2 ducks. You don't buy it. You get a friend who gifts you 2 ducks, and your 2 ducks eat a lot of slugs. You don't bring in 20 ducks into a property of whatever size. Maybe you only build 1 owl box, which you should do anyway, because you can't be building dozens of owl boxes on property. They need like 150 feet of at least, at a minimum, probably more like a mile between boxes. Something that we didn't get into today, which is another major shortfalling of permaculture, is its relationship to indigenous knowledge. Many people would say that permaculture is a co-option of indigenous knowledge, and sometimes even a bastardization of indigenous knowledge, which is a conversation that really deserves its own episode and deserves more voices. And I hope that we can do that at some point on this podcast, because it is something to be aware of. There is a side to permaculture that can be pretty toxic, and it's a valid criticism, in my opinion. So, permaculture isn't perfect, is what it comes down to. There are a lot of ethical questions and issues that should be addressed more often by the community. And what I think it really comes down to is that permaculture is whatever you make of it. It falls upon us to shape this thing that we do and we love, or hopefully we love, to be whatever we want it to be. Looking back at sort of the history of how permaculture was created and at times monetized, it falls on us to decide how we want to react to that and how we want to reshape a practice to be something new and something different and something healing and motivating and maybe less toxic. There's lots of things that I didn't get into today in this episode that really require a deep dive. What we can do is we can really just be aware of sort of the shortfalls of permaculture that have happened in the past and how moving forward, we can change or adapt or turn something that has been somewhat problematic, perhaps, into something that can be holistically better for everyone. How exactly does that change happen? I'm not entirely sure. I don't know what that means for you in the context of your home or your community. I think that motivating other people to grow their own food is huge. And if you can change the one person's opinion, maybe it's somebody who, is in your extended family who just is really wasteful and shops at their local grocery store and throws away half of what they purchase. Maybe you could build them a compost pile and see how it goes. And just something small like that can make a world of difference. And from there, we can build outwards and do more for the people around us and for our communities, and just try to reach out to others and focus less on ourselves and on our own experiences. That's one of the biggest shortfallings of permaculture, I think, is that often it is really about me. And, it's sometimes it can be more, and it should be more all the time. And maybe it's time to sort of just take a moment to say, okay, I made my property awesome. My backyard forest garden and food forest is kicking, it's popping, it's in year 6, and now it's time to divide it up. And what am I gonna do with all these plant divisions? Maybe give them away to friends and family to start their own forest garden. Maybe reach out to the town council and propose a design in your neighborhood. Who knows? The possibilities are pretty endless when it comes to that sort of intervention. So please, I hope that this was a beneficial reflection, this whole episode, and I hope that it motivates you to make change in your community as permaculture has motivated me to make change in mine.